It is Sunday, February 23rd, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. Today we have a special guest for you on the program. He is the former advisor on economics to the Prime Minister and both first two ministers of finance for this Liberal government. He is a senior fellow at the Munk School at the University of Toronto, and he is a policy advisor working in the private sector. Tyler Meredith, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jake, for having me. It's really nice to be one of your first few guests, and congratulations on starting the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you on the program. You are certainly a well-accomplished fellow in the sphere of Canadian politics, to put it mildly.
I always enjoy debating with you. We don't always see eye to eye, but we always have an interesting conversation. So should be an interesting hour.
Indeed. And if anything, people do like when I argue with people on this podcast. So it should make for good ratings. I guess the first question to dig into is just tell us more about your role working in the Liberal government and how long that was for and what economic advisor really entailed.
Sure. So I was in the government from late 2015, right after the election, until kind of September 2022. And it was kind of an accidental situation in which I found myself working for the government in that capacity. So just to take a step back, I've been a Liberal since I was probably 11 or 12. My very first election campaign that I remember volunteering on, it was in 1997 in Ottawa Centre for Mac Harb, of all people, which... interesting history if you want to Google Mac Harb. But I say that because I had always seen kind of politics as a volunteer, not a vocational activity. It was always something that was kind of on the side of my pursuits, through university and then in my professional career. And I had been in management consulting and in the think tank world for a number of years, for about, about 15 years almost before. 10 years, I should say, before moving into government. And in that 2015 campaign, which was actually one of the first campaigns that I had not engaged with as a Liberal since I was 11 or 12, maybe that's luck on the side of
fair amount of irony there.
Yeah, exactly. I knew I was working at IRPP at the Institute for Research and Public Policy. I had to be officially nonpartisan, which is why I wasn't involved in that campaign. But I knew people who were involved in the campaign. And so I would just flip them ideas of stuff that I saw in the academic literature that I thought was interesting and important. And then after the campaign, they sought some advice on transition, and I gave a bit of it, not thinking that anything would come of it. And at the end of that process, they said, do you want to come and work for the Prime Minister? And of course, you never say no in those kinds of situations, even if you're not expecting it. It was great experience. I walked into it not knowing exactly what the job would entail, and it ended up mostly, I would say, helping to coordinate the budget process, which if anyone's ever been exposed to in government, kind of you touch everything, at least on the domestic side, which is really where I focus. You touch every kind of nook and cranny of government, of all the different requests that come in, largely trying to set what's the economic and fiscal strategy of what we're trying to achieve, whether that's, at the beginning of our first mandate, it was obviously to implement some of the big commitments that we had done in the campaign, like the Canada Child Benefit, but also in an environment in which we had a recession. People forget this, but when Trudeau was elected, there was a commodities recession that had been working its way through global energy markets for about a year, and that had a huge effect in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Newfoundland. And so our very first budget, it was like, how are we going to spend the kind of $10 billion of discretionary money that kind of expect these initiatives are going to require? Well, on the other hand, government revenues and expenses have changed such that the deficits on its own, without any new dollar of investment, increased by $20 billion. You put those two and two together, you're at a $30 billion deficit. How do you make all of this work, right? What's your strategy? So I spent a lot of time in my time in government on kind of that interface of social policy and economic policy and how to manage those in the context of a budget, and had a lot of fun doing it, and ended up working at both finance and PMO and kind of seeing the budget process from both sides. We can get into the dynamics of what that looks like for folks like Christopher Freeland and Bill Morneau, but that was a lot of what I did in my time in government.
And if there's anything that you really miss from your time working on the Hill and at the Prime Minister's office, what would it be?
I think for a lot of my experience in government, it was just the fact that every day you wake up, you can do so much good, right? I think people who go into government sometimes don't realize that the job that they will have in government is the most impact that they can have in any one day or in any short period of time than they can get from any other pursuit in their career. Not to say that there aren't other things you can do in your job in a career that will have impact, but not to that degree, right? Not to the degree to which you could, literally bring forward policy that will lift people out of poverty, that will respond to potential trade war, that will help to support people who have accidentally found themselves in an unemployment situation because of an energy crisis, or how to deal with a global pandemic. There's just the capacity of government to do big things, which, as progressives, and I consider myself a progressive, I think we can sometimes forget that that's the core mission, right? Is to try to help people in their daily lives. And government is a force for good. It can't do everything, but it is a huge force for good, the most impactful force for good. So I think if there's anything that I miss about it, it's just the notion that, like, you have at your disposal the levers, in the sense that, like, I could pick up the phone and call anybody almost in the world that I would want to talk to in order to solve a problem. They'll probably answer my phone call in a way that, after government or before government, you don't have that same impact, right? And I, like, I remember a very vivid micro example. There was a piece of a major building, a YMCA project in Ottawa, that was about to potentially have to go up for sale because the YMCA of Ottawa was facing some financial difficulties. And that project potentially put at risk several hundred units of affordable housing. And the MP at the time was Catherine McKenna, and she called me and she said, what can we do about it? And so literally within a matter of days, she and I had devised a plan as to how to create a financial backstop to basically bail out that organization, but also more importantly, to just make sure that those units didn't fall prey to a bank loan, right? That would potentially convert those units into being owned by a REIT or by somebody else who has no interest in maintaining those units at a modest rental income that people who are vulnerable can afford, right? And I just think back on that example. It's like, I was able to solve that very discrete problem because I could pick up the phone and talk to people at CMHC, and I could talk to people in the banking sector, and I could talk to people, in the nonprofit sector and in the housing sector. And I just, because of the role that I had in government, I was in a place at a nexus where I could kind of solve those problems, right? And I think anybody who's an MP, who's a cabinet minister, who's a senior political staffer, they all have a version of that same story, which is they want to be able to solve a problem. And, when you're in government, you have those levers at your disposal. And, let alone take that on a much bigger scale. You think about the pandemic, right? The ability to sit there and to think about how to solve the problem of how do we get money into people's hands so that we prop up the economy. And if we prop up the economy, we'll be able to keep people kind of in place, right? And stop potentially the spread of a disease. And so, some of these things you don't ever train for, but I just think there's both a thrill and a high that comes from being able to, frankly, solve some big intractable problems.
Indeed. And I know it's being able to get into power, to use that power to solve problems and improve people's lives, is part of why I've participated in electoral politics and other forms of politics. And I know it is a motivating factor for a lot of people, especially considering that this sector certainly pays lower compensation than if you work in the private sector. You're either giving up something good in order, or you're doing it for a bad purpose, and hopefully people are doing it for the benevolent purpose. But I guess the follow-up question that obviously it comes after that is, what do you regret not fixing before you left government?
Well, look, there's I could answer that in a number of ways. I think that probably the biggest one is housing, and I say that in part because I was very involved in the creation of the first national housing strategy in 2017. It was one of the core files that I worked on, and closely with Adam Vaughan and a few other people. And I'm not going to sit here and say that the National Housing Strategy 1.0 solved all the world's problems. It clearly didn't, because the housing market got worse. But it still built 100,000 units, right? And it still started the the work of getting the federal government back significantly into the business of financing affordable housing, of developing projects itself, of thinking about its various tools for convening with municipal and provincial governments, and eventually down the road to doing things that would also structurally reform the supply side of the broader kind of market rental system. I say regret because I think we, at the time, were not well served in properly diagnosing the problem. We thought that the problem was kind of twofold. One, the federal government's absent. Let's put the federal government back in to try to solve part of the deeply affordable part of the of low income housing, where the federal government had been previously a very large kind of financer with the origination of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And secondly, let's maybe think about some modest tools that tamp down on the demand side, right? Without really thinking about, okay, well, but how is the rate of production, is the supply side of the curve sufficiently well developed and robust that it can actually meet the equilibrium point of the housing market that we want to achieve? And clearly the answer to that was no, but we didn't think about that side of the problem, partly because I don't think a lot of people, certainly not a lot of economists, were thinking about that side of the problem then the way they are now. But also because we didn't think about it, I think, in the way that it has since become a math problem, right? In the sense that if you think about your goals of population growth, and you think about what is the current rate of housing production to meet population growth, and to what extent there is a cumulative imbalance in the housing market because of population growth over the last several decades, even before we think about raising immigration levels, that analysis would have told you we're probably several million short of the number of units that we need for a healthy, balanced housing market circa 2016. And so nobody did that exercise in 2016-17. None of the public servants, we didn't do that work. None of the external economists were even doing that work. Even
and to push on that a little, that is a bit mildly concerning, because obviously you're a far more accomplished economist than I am. But from whenever I read a book like Economics for Dummies, or I see like an Econ 101 class in a university, like supply and demand curves tend to be pretty early in the discussion, and it does kind of shock me that supply just wasn't a consideration for such a long time.
Well, so we were focused on one kind of supply, which was the deeply affordable, low-income end of the market, because that's where the absence of federal leadership had been so pronounced since the 1990s, when the federal government got out of the business of investing in affordable housing almost completely, right? And so we thought, okay, we just need to reestablish the federal government in that space. Except the problem was, you could reestablish the federal government and you could build 100,000 units, but that would be so swamped by all of the other larger order effects that were going on in the market that it wouldn't make any difference.
And 100,000 also just doesn't really compare much to, say, what we would have been doing between the 60s and the 90s. It was a good effort, but 100%. We need to go a bit further.
100%. And this is where I think that there was a cardinal mistake, in that if we had sat down and said, the problem is that we're missing, let's say, as we now believe it's, somewhere in the order of 3.5 to 4 million units of housing. Let's say at that time it was maybe 2.5 or 3 million, right? Back in 2016-17. If someone had put down on paper something that said, we're currently missing X, and by the way, to meet your population growth projections on immigration that you want to put forward, which, by the way, at the time, every economist was saying you should increase immigration because it would be great for the economy, and the economy would be able to keep up with rising population growth because it would create a separate supply side response. You put those two things together, instead of X, you maybe need 1.5X, right, of units. And let's say that that's maybe 2.5 or 3 million units. If somebody had quantified that to us and then said, and by the way, for the 8 or 10 billion that you're going to invest in housing in the next several years, that's only going to give you a couple 100,000. And we would have realized, wow, we're short, 2.5 million minus 200,000, we're short 2.3 million, right? I think it would have, forced us to think about the connectivity between immigration policy and the housing market. But it also would have forced us to say, instead of spending 8 or 10 billion, maybe we need to spend 40 billion. And I say that because in the absence of having that kind of framing device, we weren't really having a realistic conversation about what is the degree of intervention and investment that's required.
You were
And I think
discussing how much money you were willing to spend and how much housing that would create, rather than how much housing you need to create and how much. So, I guess, and to follow up on the discussion of how immigration has affected the demand for housing, I mean, obviously, when more people come here, more housing needs to exist. That part of the supply and demand chain is clear. But there are also other economic reasons that we do need immigration, especially because our population rate is below replacement level. People are not having enough kids to keep the population growing if we don't allow people to immigrate. And also, just because in general we are an immigrant nation, and something does feel a bit weird to me about closing the door right behind me after my family came here in a very similar way. But what concerns me about the discussion on how immigration affects the housing crisis is that there does appear to be a bit of scapegoating going on. Not that I'm suggesting that's what you're doing, but I don't think so at all. But you get how, like, we say, oh, we need to lower immigration so that we can build enough housing. But then after we lower immigration, the same government figures say, okay, now we can lower how much housing we need to build. And I'm like, well, wait, if you lower immigration, but then you still build the same amount of housing you were originally planning, then the price of housing would go even lower. Why are you trying to do this weird math that keeps the price of housing at a certain level rather than trying to make it as affordable as we can?
So if you think about the supply and demand imbalance in the housing market as being, are we able to basically create sufficient amount of homes, assuming a constant kind of rate of housing density in terms of the number of people per unit, and those preferences will change over time as people age, et cetera. But if you assume a constant kind of like number of people per house, per housing unit over time, and you look at just the cumulative growth of housing stock relative to the cumulative growth of population, and you run that across the last 5 decades, what you would see in Canada is that from the 70s and 80s, we were basically building more. In fact, if anything, we were oversupplying the housing market relative to population growth, which reflects a period of time in which there was a high degree of affordability in the housing market. Partly because we were building lots of rental stock. We had strong tax incentives, both for low-income housing, but frankly also for modest market housing. It's why you see in places like Montreal and Toronto, right, a large stock of rental housing unit, even market rental housing unit that has been in place in existence since the 1970s. And then,
which couldn't be built today, mind you.
Pardon?
It would housing stock that couldn't be built today either because there are new zoning regulations or because the financing to allow it simply does not exist.
That's right. There's a great program that people should go back and look at, historically called MERBs, and it was a very rich tax incentive, but helped create a lot of housing very quickly in the 1970s and early 80s. And it was eventually cut because it was too successful, which meant it was too costly to the fiscal treasury at the time in the early 80s, as both the late Trudeau government and then the Mulroney government were having to grapple with these problems. And what's interesting is that as you go through the 80s into the early 90s, it's in the early 90s that you start to see this reversion where instead of building more housing than we need, or about the same housing that we need to keep up with population growth, we start to see a drop-off of housing starts across the board. We lose the creation of all of these market rental units. We go through an early 90s recession in which there just isn't a lot of incentive for people to build even single detached homes. And so we stop building stuff, and the population keeps growing at the rates that it's been growing at, and immigration continues to come in somewhere in the order of 200 and some thousand people, right? And so we go through that. We start to go through now a new period where demand is outstripping supply. And for the first 10 or 15 years, we don't really notice it. It actually kind of looks maybe buoyant and good because it actually means that housing prices are starting to rise. And given a high level of home ownership in Canada, higher than in the EU, right? About 60% of Canadians tend to own their home. That's seen as a positive economic story, right? Because asset prices are rising, and this is asset prices are rising in a time in which asset prices across the board, the stock market is starting to boom in the late 90s, right? And so home ownership is a positive thing, right? And we're not concerned about this supply-demand imbalance. That will eventually catch up to us about a decade and a half, 2 decades later.
But by
right?
the time it does, all the politicians responsible for it are retired.
Exactly. And my point being is that to the point you just made about immigration a few minutes ago, once you get to 2015-16, right, and we're in this situation in which housing has become the most attractive asset class because it has so consistently risen, because there is this consistent imbalance between supply and demand.
And not just consistently risen, but shown a government willing to protect its rise against
government's plural.
Factors.
Government's plural, right? Like, let's remember that housing costs increase almost double
federal,
during the Harper
provincial,
regime, in the same way that
municipal.
housing costs have increased.
There's certainly been a cross-party alliance regarding that.
So I say this as an explanation, a long-winded explanation, because to your point about immigration, the problem in 2016, 17, 18 onward is so severe in the housing market that even if we decided that we wanted to keep immigration levels where they were, or even cut them, which no Canadian would be generally supportive of, right? We're talking about 2015 levels of immigration where it's 250, not 500K or a million, right? You would still have, going forward, a housing market that's not, in terms of the number of starts, which generally produces about 200,000, 230,000 starts per year, on its own would not be able to keep up with the growth of the natural population in Canada. And so that's the basic problem. And by the time we were building the National Housing Strategy in 2017, it's ironic, but the public policy discourse was not talking that way, in a way that now they are, and they have been for the last several years. That's a very healthy shift that we've seen in the public policy discourse. But that was not what was really on the focus of a lot of people, certainly from a demand-supply imbalance back in 2016, 17. So my biggest regret is that we didn't, certainly while I was there in government, I didn't have enough time by the time that there was clearly a shift in the data to support, I think, that pivot, to be able to execute that pivot. Now, I think there's been a lot of very good efforts that have been made by people like Sean Fraser, by Nate Erskine-Smith, by others in the course of the last 2 years that have really, I think, shown the degree of ambition that we needed. But we were slow, let's admit, as a government, to making that pivot, in part because I also think we were slow to acknowledge that the structural imbalances that exist in how we are unable as a country to build at the rate of housing that we need for our population growth, let alone what happens with immigration, it has many factors behind it, some of which are difficulties with access to labor, some of which are the fact that the way we construct stuff hasn't literally changed for 50, 60 years in the way that other manufactured goods have massively transformed in terms of their manufacturing process. Part of it is that we're not capital intensive enough. Part of it is an access to capital problem. Part of it is that government levers are misaligned. But part of it is also because we have very restrictive zoning laws at the provincial and municipal level. And let's admit, I think we as Liberals have sometimes coddled municipalities far too much and mayors far too much, in part because we wanted to be the good guys. We wanted to partner with mayors because we've seen them as willing and able collaborators on things like transit and other projects. And, you know, perhaps what we're realizing is we maybe got taken advantage of, right? In that the federal government has come in and financed a lot of stuff, and it hasn't necessarily been as quick to change the production side and the means of production for these kinds of goods that we need more of in our country. And I think, look, the government clearly has gotten that message in the last 2 or 3 years. You see a significant, I think, aggressiveness on the part of the federal government, especially with the Housing Accelerator Fund, something that was in our 2021 election campaign and I was part of. But I just think, you know, let's admit, and Sean Fraser has said this himself, we were too slow as a government to pivot. And so, you know, back to your original question, that is my regret.
Valid. And then I guess for our final question before we go into the break, like when you talk about how, on more than just housing, but a wide variety of issues, you talk about how eventually the Liberal Party needed to be willing to be more aggressive on the issue, not be every single person's friend and say, well, you need to play ball or you won't receive funding. Do you think, like, and I understand how in a party that isn't just a big tent party, but makes the big tent a core part of the identity, how it can be hard to take a stance that might alienate one wing or another. But do you feel that the Liberal Party in general on a variety of issues might need to start taking more aggressive stances and be willing to stand on something specific, even if it makes a few members on the fringe upset?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. I think the Prime Minister himself, there are some moments in which he's really good at prosecuting a villain or an opponent. And once he's got somebody in their gun sights, whether they're an oligopoly or Donald Trump, he's very effective in putting together both the political strategy and the policy strategy to go after them. I think in this particular case, whether it's premiers on healthcare or mayors on housing, I think it's sometimes been perhaps a little uncomfortable, especially with mayors, because we have seen them as political partners, right? Sometimes because in many cases they've been a level of government that we can work with at times where there are conservative premiers, right? And they are the only people on the ground that we have as natural allies on things like infrastructure. So look, if you want to take those aggressive swings, you have to understand that there's going to be consequences, collateral consequences to some of the other things that you want to do, right? But at the same time, if a lot of the Trudeau agenda has been about how to effectively use the federal spending power in order to do things, whether it's to reduce poverty, which we've done very effectively, whether it's to help to hold people harmless during a pandemic and an economic crisis, which we've also done very effectively, we have to acknowledge that the federal spending power has to come with certain conditions. And I think it's the conditionality of things that we have been a little too slow to adjust to. And housing's obviously one example. I think you could make the case to a certain extent within healthcare. But look, that's not to say that the government itself is not without significant accomplishments. I think Justin Trudeau, when his time is done in the next couple of weeks, we can look back upon his time in office as a very consequential prime minister who did a lot of really big things, from fighting COVID to the CCB to negotiating CUSMA and so on. And enhancing the Canada Pension Plan. I could list many more, building the Trans Mountain Pipeline. But we were a bit deficient in some areas, and those are, I think, too, where I would note some regret.
Valid. And honestly, he would not be the first prime minister, nor the last, most likely, to become more venerated and more appreciated upon their retirement. And in fact, I think I'm already starting to see the tenor around him change now that he appears to be close out the door anyways.
Isn't it, can I just say, isn't it fascinating how almost quickly that shift happened in the mood? Just like once he said he was leaving, there was a bit of an exhale that happened, right?
Yeah, I get exactly what you mean, and I do think that honestly, a lot of political science would benefit if there was more psychology involved in the process and just
100%.
more understanding why people think the way they do. I know in economics there's a term called homo economicus, or like it's a stand-in for a normal human being, and they're supposed to be a rational actor in the economy. But the problem is what happens when somebody doesn't make rational actions in the economy. What happens when someone buys GameStop as a stock, even though they're a failing business, because it like rocket and moon emojis, and then it works. But yeah, thank you for a very good discussion, but don't leave us yet, Tyler, or you folks at home, because after the break, we will have discussion on our 3 headline topics of everything interesting and slightly terrible that's happened this week, so you can ruminate on it for the next week. Today's episode of It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau is brought to you by me. Yes, today we are asking you to please subscribe to our Substack at jakelandau.ca/subscribe. All of our content is available for free without a paywall. However, in order to fund the creation of this podcast, original journalism, and other Jake Landau endeavors, we do in fact need money, especially because I like eating food, and if I don't eat food, I'll die. So, any support you can provide is deeply appreciated. Thank you, and enjoy the show. And we are back from the break. Today, we have 3 new headline topics for you, just as always. And our first topic is the hockey game that swept the entire nation. We just a couple days ago, Team Canada at the Nations Faceoff showed the Yankees what's what, and that hockey will always be our game, no matter how much they try to play at it. Tyler, were you watching the game with the rest of the nation last time?
I was watching it at home with some friends. I think it also didn't just show the Americans, who's in charge, but I think it also showed all of Canada, right? And partly because I think we've seen these kind of split identities that a lot of Canadians have, because some people have dual U.S. citizenship, including Wayne Gretzky. But I think it also reminded us that this is our game. This is part of our own identity in a way that, I can't remember a hockey game being that important since, the Vancouver Olympics.
In some ways, it feels like it was even more important than the Summit Series in many regards. Certainly
Yes.
the most politically important game in Canada. And I know one person said to me, that she hated the fact that we were playing into Trump's rhetoric on it, about how the game mattered, because ultimately winning or losing a single sport in a single game should not be the argument for whether or not you get to be a sovereign country. But the unfortunate fact was this did matter a lot to Canadian identity, and luckily we did win. And there was a big rally around the flag moment, both figuratively and literally.
Absolutely. I don't know if you watch or listen to the Spitting Chicklets podcast, which is a bit of an acquired taste for hockey fans.
Yeah, I'm more of a John Boy guy than a Barstool guy.
Okay. Well, their last episode that they did on the post game analysis after the cup was awarded. They made an interesting point that this actually, more than anything else, in their perspective, will propel the popularity of hockey within the U.S. market. And I thought that was interesting, just because in Canada, I think everybody is, to a certain extent, a hockey fan, even a passive hockey fan, because they find moments where they are kind of pulled into it, right? Because of national pride, for the reasons you just mentioned. That's obviously not true in the US, because hockey's not
a similar dynamic to football in South America or Europe.
Exactly. And I think, to a certain extent, if Trump has done anything, at least in the U.S., it's probably that he spotlighted the sport more than, frankly, Gary Bettman could ever do.
Yeah. I do laugh when people are like, oh, this is way more financially successful than the All-Star game. Whoever planned this at the NHL should get a raise. And I'm like, I don't know that the NHL planned the worst diplomatic crisis in 100 years. But back on the Summit Series comparison, the reason I make that comparison and why I would argue this might have been even more politically significant, it's not like when the Soviet Union came over to play the Summit Series in 72 that they were like, oh yeah, and we're not only going to take back Alaska, but we're going to conquer the Yukon too. It wasn't a game being played literally for sovereignty. It was just it was a proxy for the Cold War. It wasn't actually a front in the war.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sure your parents have similar experiences as mine. They will describe watching the Summit Series, in school gymnasiums for the portion of games that were over in Russia. And, that it was that kind of unifying moment. And I think in some ways, this particular experience, this particular set of games was that. I don't know of anything else that people were doing last week, or an event that had that much unifying potential than that game.
Indeed. And on the topic of Wayne Gretzky, I know there has been some controversy over it because of his support for Donald Trump. I know at the game he didn't show up wearing any Team Canada paraphernalia or even the color red, while the honorary captain for the Team USA.
Or his pin for his Order of Canada.
Well, I've heard apparently that he's never picked up his pin, that he's not just in the Order of Canada, he's a companion, which there are very few of.
That's right.
So
Yeah, no, it's not. He's the highest in the. My understanding is he's the highest in the tiers of the Order of Canada.
and he was
Um,
invested in 2009, and he still never picked up
that's
the
right.
pin.
Yeah,
That
no, Patricia Treble, if anyone wants to look her up on what was formerly known as Twitter, does a great thread on this every little while whenever the story pops back up because she wrote about it from Maclean's. Yeah, no, he's never picked it up. And it's weird because it's not like, Wayne Gretzky doesn't have the means to come to Ottawa if he wants. I'm sure that he could arrange any time he wants with the Governor General to have a ceremony to get it. It just, I think, reflects the fact that once he left Edmonton, I think a lot of his focus and his identity has clearly been in the United States. I mean, he's a Trumper, right? Like he showed up at the Trump Victory Party. He's a member of the Mar-a-Lago Golf Club. He wears the Make America Great Again hat.
parallels to Alexander Ovechkin are very similar. Like it's when people are talking about Ovechkin surpassing Gretzky, I'm like, I don't really like either of them. I mean, they're both undoubtedly great at the sport. I respect their skill at hockey. I just don't think that means that anyone should listen to a word they say on anything that isn't playing hockey. Like
totally. And I think, we go through this veneration of sports celebrities, put them up on a bit of a pedestal sometimes that is, I think we're increasingly finding is maybe not warranted or needs to be.
I mean, there was a recent piece, I forgot whether it was today or yesterday, by Bobby Orr in the National Post, saying, don't criticize the great one. And I'm like, Wayne Gretzky is just a good athlete. He's not like a fucking god.
No, and look, we are increasingly realizing, I think, as a country, that the enemy is Trumpism. It isn't even just Trump; it's Trumpism, and the wide-reaching popularity of Trumpism within the United States. I don't want to say that every American is our enemy because that would be untrue, but the problem isn't just one person, right? It's the product of a society that has created Donald Trump and that has made his very vile policies something that so many people. Right, that millions and millions of people have embraced, even knowing all of the consequences of what it could potentially entail. And part of the enablement of that is people like Wayne Gretzky, who go around and say that this is a completely appropriate and valid argument at this moment in time. And he's not the first sports celebrity. Like there's a lot of sports celebrities, obviously, who are pro-Trump. And I think there's maybe an argument to be made about whether it's because they're all a bunch of rich guys, right? That they kind of see something in Trump that they like, but they are the enablers.
True.
They are the enablers to Trump.
And it does, and I know what you mean, not just in hockey, but in a lot of men's sports. I bear no illusions that most of these guys probably do not. They lean right. They listen to people like Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn. I'm in no illusions under it, but admittedly, it is part of why I like watching PWHL, why I like watching women's hockey, because I don't need to worry about whether most of those players support a queer person's right to exist. Like, two of the women on Team Canada are married to each other. It's fantastic. Like, could you imagine in the NHL, like, two spouses playing on the same team, and if one of them got in a fight, like, the other guy just does a Superman punch and lays the guy out? Like, it would be amazing. Like, I don't think that the NHL understands what they're missing. Like, I think we need more woke DEI in the NHL. I want at least 5 gay people on every single team.
Well, look, I mean, statistically speaking, if you assume that LGBTQ population represents somewhere between 5 and 10%, right? You run the math.
Oh, yeah, they're there. Yeah. It's just
right?
that they don't. And I know one Sportsnet writer, or a writer for The Athletic, talked about how they saw an NHL player and a friend in town in Toronto for the Pride Parade. And then the player messaged him after to say, hey, please don't tell anybody you saw me here. Like, that we all know there are queer people in the league, in every men's sports league. They just don't feel safe talking about it. And that, that does make me upset.
Well, look, I think there may be some day in which your vision is realized. I think we were getting to a place where there was certainly more open for players to not only share their own, share who they are, but also to share their own political views. That was happening up until about a year or so ago, right? When we had the controversy over Pride tape in the NHL.
I do feel sincerely bad for Brian Burke.
Yeah, look, and he's somebody who has a very personal attachment to it, but also as a general manager and coach, understood the benefit of a locker room in which people could be themselves, right?
Indeed.
Understood that that's part of culture of how you build a winning team, and I just think that what's happened in the NHL and in a number of sports leagues is that they are large corporations, right? Or they are structures of large corporations, and they are susceptible to the same pressures that we have seen play out against DEI and other pressure against certain capitalist activism that has hit boardrooms across North America, right, in the last number of years, and the pendulum will eventually swing back in the other direction, I believe.
I hope so, because I used to be I've always been cynical of pink capitalism or green capitalism, or really anytime they're like, oh, hey, TD Bank sponsors the Pride Parade. We like you guys. But, I do miss it now that it's gone.
Yeah.
Moving on to our next topic. This one's a two-pronged topic because we have both a leadership race in Ottawa for the Liberal Party of Canada to determine the next Prime Minister, and we also have an Ontario election that is about to happen on Thursday. So we're going to talk a bit about both, but first, new developments in the Liberal leadership race. Ruby Dhalla has been disqualified after...
Dr. Ruby Dhalla.
Dr. Ruby Dhalla. My sincere apologies to the doctor. But she's been disqualified after financial irregularities. And the one that popped out the most to me and made me go, yeah, that's not above board at all, is when apparently, and it was found that 12 separate people donated to her campaign with the same credit card. Mm-hmm. And this isn't just a party rule thing. These are official donations regulated by Elections Canada that you must make with your own money. So, Tyler, for this week's No Prize, do you believe that if 12 people used the same credit card to donate, they were all donating with their own money?
Probably not.
Probably not is the correct answer. Congratulations on your No Prize. Obviously, we don't know for sure. Any financial arrangement is possible, but it doesn't look good.
No, I mean, look, so we've had the first filings that have come from all the leadership campaigns with Elections Canada. We'll get, I think, one or two more before the race is done. It's interesting because if you look through the filings of the different campaigns, and this came out before the party made its decision on Friday, you can see in a few instances that there have been donations that have had to be returned by the parties, and they have to compile that and show Elections Canada why. And in some cases, it can be because somebody over-contributed or because they're not an eligible donor or whatnot. But probably on the scale of the things that, if you're Elections Canada and you're the Liberal Party of Canada, the two things you would be most concerned by or most concerned to see potentially, it's what we call straw donor financing, right? It's the notion that somebody is putting money forward in their own name that is not actually their own funds and is not intended to be a true donation on their part.
And so this isn't a new thing. When people ask why the Liberal Party adopted free donations, free memberships, mind you, most recently at the provincial level in Ontario, it's because I can never say if every person did it, but I know that when a membership costs $5, when you went to the door to sign people up, I know a lot of people who weren't asking for the $5. The campaign was just attaching $5 bills. And there's no way to prove that, obviously, if you're going to accept it in cash. So at a certain point, there was an understanding that this was just a financial gatekeeping mechanism to prioritize some candidates over others for nominations. So they got rid of it to get rid of financial abuse and fraud.
Yep, that's right. And seeing like the same credit card numbers is a clear marker of what anyone, if they were investigating anti-money laundering, would pop up in that system, right, as a red flag. And look, there are other, as I say, on the spectrum of things that you might be an ineligible donation that you have to reverse. There's many reasons why that can happen, in part because it can be someone inputted the wrong number when they were going through and making the contribution. Maybe
or the party accidentally overbilled them, which is a thing that has happened to me personally. I had a while where my monthly donation was accidentally getting double billed.
Right. And to a certain extent, the campaigns don't have a way to stop that. They can only cure the problem after the fact.
Right, because they don't know what you've donated to another party.
Exactly. In this particular case, right, where it's a situation of somebody potentially using multiple credit cards, multiple people using the same credit card number going to the same place, it has a sense of fishiness to it that I think is qualitatively different than you would see in other cases of donations that have to be returned. And so for that reason, I think it was right that the party Rules Committee decided that this was a potentially disqualifying situation. I think perhaps it was also beneficial. And I'm not imputing a particular motive, but I think let's admit that it's beneficial. I think perhaps to the party that going into the debates we're going to have this week, that
someone at the French language debate who can't speak French is not participating.
There's that issue for sure, which would have been a ridiculous sideshow for the French debate. But like, she's been a completely unserious candidate in this race. Like the memes that she has put online, where she has openly called herself the female Donald Trump, right? Which is close enough potentially to being like Canada's Tulsi Gabbard. Like, I just think that in a world in which we are getting ready for a general election and trying to put forward a serious alternative to Pierre Poilievre, whoever emerges from the field to be that serious alternative, she would distract significantly from our ability as a party to be able to do that. And so I'm not saying that I don't think that there was any intention to get rid of her for that reason, but it happens to be that in this particular own goal that her campaign seems to have created, right, by not dealing with these particular donations in the appropriate manner, I think it's provided, frankly, a very advantageous outcome for all involved, just because she was, I think, going to be a candidate that would be quite destructive potentially to the party going forward.
Indeed. And obviously I believe, I've stated before, I think that nominations and party contests should simply be run by Elections Canada or Elections Ontario, and it taking.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you on that.
Valid, but I think there are certain benefits to it. For one, you can make sure someone isn't a member of several parties. You can make sure they're not donating to several parties, I think. And also because I'm of the opinion that an AOC or a Bernie Sanders wouldn't be able to run in Canada because they wouldn't be greenlit to contest an incumbent sitting member of the same party. But undoubtedly, American democracy is healthier for their presence. But I guess what I do have to question here is if there are significant concerns as to the financial soundness of donations made to Ms. Dhalla's campaign, how can the party keep her $300,000 non-refundable fee?
Well, remember that those are donations to the Liberal Party of Canada, right? That once processed, eventually then get rebated back to the campaign. Look, the party's going to have to sort out whether or not they will accept a certain amount of the expenses she's already incurred to deduct against the 350, right? Like, the party doesn't keep the 350. This is, I think, what's not understood about the deposits. They were more or less, so there's a portion of deposits.
There is some confusion when you hear like refundable 50,000 and a non-refundable 300,000. So please do educate the listeners at home.
So the party doesn't really keep the money. What the party is doing is basically saying you have to show that you have fundraised above a certain level for you to continue along in the race. And in fact, it's basically just a test of your seriousness as a candidate. And at the end of the day, if we come to the end of the race and the parties have a surplus because the party has set a high bar for how much fundraising has to occur, then that's a surplus that can be transferred into the party funds at a later point in time, right? But and you saw this a little bit with the question about what was Chrystia Freeland's number, because what happens mechanically is campaigns can either have the money go directly to the party, right, and then it gets sent back to them by the party, or they can collect the money and then process those donations to the party. So there's slightly different processes that they can choose. But the point being that it's not like the party sitting on her $350,000. They would have, through the process, have already returned monies to her campaign to be able to run. The question will be, though, if she's now disqualified, what happens to the expenses that she has incurred? Does the party let her use, at least acknowledging the expenses she's incurred to date, and let her use the funds that it has previously returned out of escrow to her as eligible to be counted against those expenses, or are those expenses she will have to deal with on her own? I'm not an elections lawyer. I don't know how that's going to be litigated. That'll be an interesting question.
Indeed. Now, moving on to the second half of our second discussion topic, for the Ontario provincial election, we have the election in about 4 days, and obviously nothing is called until no poll matters as much as the actual election results themselves. But things are not looking particularly good for any progressive party that is not the... Yeah.
So look, with the caveat that I am an advisor to the Liberal campaign, to the Central campaign, to Bonnie Crombie. Here's a couple of things that I would say. The first is I think we all underestimate the significant advantage that Doug Ford has had in calling this election as a snap election. People will say, I'm sure Evans Grimshaw and others will say, well, but you should have been prepared that there was going to be an election. Sure, that's fine. But I think even this was earlier than the early election that we were expecting to have, right? Most people assumed that an early election would be called sometime in the spring after they would have tabled a budget, because at the time, what the Conservatives were trying to get ready for was to get ahead of a Poilievre majority, assuming that Poilievre majority, if it were to happen, would be kind of destructive to progressive Conservatives.
Although, to be fair, Lisa MacLeod did pretty much say the exact date that the election would happen.
As stupid as Lisa is, she gave that up. But by the time,
I don't know if she was being stupid. I think she was being petty towards Doug Ford.
Yeah, yes, that could be too. But by the time she said that online, I think the writing was on the wall that they now were trying to go for a February writ as opposed to a May writ, because the February writ was now about Donald Trump.
Right.
And so my only point is, even if we had, and by we I mean like all of the other parties other than Doug Ford, even if we had 3 or 4 more months to prepare, that would have significantly, I think, changed the context of the campaign, because you would have had a slate of candidates more ready to go across the province for all parties, for the Greens, for the Liberals, for the New Democrats. And I think it also would have potentially changed the question of, are you talking about a platform that's already previously out and, you're fighting on ground that you've already staked out in advance, or are you trying to, deal with this kind of exogenous shock of Trump and then somehow pull the electorate's attention away from that into other issues like healthcare? And I think the challenge of this campaign has been, obviously, Trump has occupied a large amount of the oxygen, not all of the oxygen in the campaign, but a large amount of the oxygen, which has been favorable to Ford. And it's just been a difficult election to get any interest in. Like the media coverage, the number of stories that there are covering on a day-to-day basis in this election is the lowest probably it has ever been of any election, which is, I think speaks to certainly a trend we've been seeing in campaigns for a while, that it's moving away from traditional mainstream coverage and just into what you buy, and what you buy as media coverage on your own through digital advertising, or the kind of earned media that you can create through events and stunts and issues, right? And so I guess what I'm the long-winded way of saying, and this may sound like self-defense more than anything else, but I think we may, as progressives, be holding ourselves to an unrealistic standard if the standard in this election, by which we evaluate the results later this week whenever we see them, as though could we have held Ford to a minority or won the election. I don't think that was ever going to be in the cards if this was a snap election by the way Doug Ford called it. And I think all parties have been hampered by the structural advantage on which he's been able to define the campaign.
Why do you think that Ford is being rewarded for calling a snap election while Trudeau was punished for it?
Well, I mean, was Trudeau punished for it? I mean, he got a government in 2021 that has since lasted the longest of any minority government in Canadian history.
True, but he didn't get the majority he was asking for, and current projections show that Doug Ford might end up with more seats than he did before.
He didn't get, you're right, he didn't get the majority, but he did increase his seats, right? Which we regarded as a win, albeit maybe at the time it was not seen as that much of a win, but like we increased our seat count. And more importantly, and I think this is the factor that's been in Ford's head and in the head of people around him, is that if you win and you win under conditions either that allow you with a minority or with the majority to do so, that extends the life of your government by another 4 years, that's effectively more years of time in office than you would have otherwise had, right? And in Trudeau's case, it was a successful call because if he had waited on the normal calendar, he would have been going to the electorate in October of 2023. I think we know enough about what's happened with the inflation crisis that would have been a horrific period of time.
There are not many incumbent parties around the globe who managed to survive that inflation crisis.
Exactly.
And it didn't matter that the inflation was global. Everybody said it was the fault of their local government.
That's right. And so from that perspective, it was the right call to call an election. And I was actually on a political panel with Corey tonight the day that the writ was issued. And I opened the panel by saying, so this is the anti-hypocrisy advertisement at the beginning of the panel. I'm going to say I was involved in calling the 2021 election. Corey's been involved in calling this election. We're not going to argue with each other about calling this election because it was equally to each other's advantage to do so at that time.
Rules of engagement.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just think they saw an opportunity and they took advantage of it. It's a selfish opportunity in the same way that people could criticize and did criticize Trudeau for the selfish choice in 2021. But it's a selfish choice, that's cost us 190 million, and people will have to decide whether that 190 million was best used on that election.
Valid. And ultimately, people, even if you do get criticism for it being a selfish choice, if you win, you're a selfish winner.
Absolutely. Look, I think assuming that Doug Ford wins, and look, we don't know what will happen. I think it's possible we're going to have very, very low voter turnout, unfortunately, which may lead to some very interesting and unexpected vote splits that could have some weird results.
I do like wild swings.
Yeah. So I'm not going to let's just at least speak theoretically about this for now. But, if Ford wins another 4 years, I do think one of the things this election may have done is it will at least have put healthcare at a higher level in the accountability of the government about what's happening. And the very fact that Doug Ford felt compelled to go off and try to hire Jane Philpott for whatever fake initiative that thing is, right? It tells you that he feels some defensiveness on this issue in a way that 2 or 3 years ago he did not. And, that in and of itself may be somewhat of a victory as we look at what the government's agenda for the next 4 years may be. So progressives going into whatever the makeup of the next legislature looks like, I would be saying I would continue to push heavily on healthcare because that does feel like where the premier has even acknowledged himself he is most vulnerable.
And on the final question before we move on to our last topic of the day, do you think that the Ontario Liberals and the Ontario NDP are going to have to reevaluate the relationship they have with each other?
Well, again, so look, as I said, I'm an advisor to the Liberal campaign, and so what I'm about to say is just me speaking. If you look at and I've only seen one poll ask this question, which is, would you support the merger of the two parties? You only get somewhere around 2/3 support in both cases. And if you think about just the math of how you get to a place where you can overcome Ford, a scenario in which you lose 1/3 of voters in both your camps.
That won't do it.
It doesn't do it. It just doesn't. There's not enough numbers there, right,
True.
to be able to.
But there is a lot of space between a merger and
There
not
is.
hating each other. I
There
know
is.
I already brought it up on last week's podcast, but I know there's the liberal agreement between the Liberals and the National Party in Australia because they have separate identities. One's more popular in urban areas, one's more popular in rural areas. So it would hurt them to merge, but they have enough priorities they agree on that cooperation and some arrangements do make sense in their favor. And they win a lot of governments that way.
Yes, and look, I was also involved in this, in dealing with the supply and confidence agreement federally, and I would say, there's a lot of people who criticize the supply and confidence agreement federally, but if you poll people on it, Liberals and New Democrats like it. They like the idea of progressive parties collaborating. So I think you're right that there's a question there as to how can we work together towards common objectives without losing the institutional structures that keep our identities as somewhat different, because we are different parties. There are things that we disagree on, and notably in this provincial campaign, there's a really stark difference between Meredith and Bonnie, in that Meredith has $27 billion worth of tax increases in her platform. Bonnie has zero. Bonnie doesn't believe in new taxes. Meredith does, but they both believe in investing in public services, right? And so there's clearly an opening there as to how can those parties work together on certain objectives. But again, I think we're still very early days in Canada in understanding what is political, what is acceptable as means to do that. I think
let's not write any obituaries before the election actually ends.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. But also, I would just say, I think even though the supply and confidence agreement federally has been successful amongst the camps of those parties, I think we also have to acknowledge the supply and confidence agreement has been deeply unpopular with people in the broader universe who are the swing voter that we want to be able to potentially attract. And so political parties have to decide, right, how they navigate these waters in ways that keep the broadest number of people on side. And so I think merger's off the table. I think supply and confidence agreement's off the table. I think the question is, can you work together on things on an issue by issue basis? And that's kind of what Bonnie has said in the course of the campaign when she's got the question. And I think progressives generally want to look at ways we can collaborate on the sets of issues where we agree, because there are a lot of things where we do agree on.
Valid. All right, moving on to our final topic of the discussion for today. And as you folks know, for our third and final topic every episode, we usually like to cover something that's flown a bit under the radar. And it tells you how insane this week has been that somehow this flew under the radar. Recently, a member of Parliament, Charlie Angus, has introduced a petition from one of his constituents requesting that the Elon Musk, who is a member of Donald Trump's government and who has helped Donald Trump across the vast majority of his political goals in that role in Trump's government, requesting that Elon Musk have his Canadian citizenship revoked. Now, mind you, I don't believe this would be legal even if the Parliament changed some laws, because he didn't become a naturalized citizen. His mother was a Canadian who was born here. So I think that there are very, very high legal bars that I don't imagine the Supreme Court of Canada would allow it to cross. At the same time, I do understand the significant concerns over a Canadian citizen helping a world leader who wants to erase our independence. It certainly asks a lot of questions about why we have laws like sedition and treason on the books. But Tyler, over 70,000 people, as of the last reporting, had apparently signed this petition. How does that compare to other petitions that you've seen introduced in Parliament? And do you?
Oh, that's way high. That it's not. I don't think it's the most popular petition that has ever been filed, but it is definitely way higher than almost any other that ordinarily gets tabled, even ones that the government kind of sometimes pays attention to, including on things like who should be on the $5 bill and whatnot, right? Look, when I saw this on the list that you sent me, I was a little of two minds, because I'm in favor of booing at the national anthem, at the U.S. national anthem. Like I'm on the side of Americans need to know that there are consequences for the way in which you're going to royally fuck up a historic relationship like this, all because of Donald Trump.
And if they didn't want us to keep booing, they probably shouldn't have doubled and tripled down at the boos.
100%,
yeah.
100%. But on
give
this,
us your second mind.
But on this, my second mind is, and I think it's the mind that overrides my other considerations, is I just think there are so many unintended consequences of this particular move, even if you hate Elon Musk, and God knows I hate Elon Musk.
And I do agree on that front. I think it's a very dangerous situation to be in when the government is like, oh, we're going to revoke citizenship at will.
Yeah. Like we have had, and you know this well because it's a topic you've engaged on. Like there have been long, protracted debates about whether or not to withhold citizenship from people who've been war criminals, right? Let alone other heinous crimes. And hate him or not, Elon Musk is maybe not in that category. So, look,
I
have a problem with this proposal.
Give him time; he might get there.
I have a problem with this proposal. I think a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian until such time as they've been convicted in a court of some heinous crime that potentially offends certain very fundamental values of who they are as Canada. And even then, it's constitutionally very difficult to remove that right that they have acquired, right? And so,
as it should be.
Yeah, exactly. So I was not surprised that Charlie Angus sponsored this petition to come forward. I mean, MPs often generally are pretty permissive in facilitating petitions that come from their constituents. But I think maybe Charlie deep down kind of agrees with this.
A little bit.
I wouldn't be surprised if he does.
And I know in recent times politicians have gotten a bit more restricted in what because I mean I remember like in the 90s Carolyn Parrish, who's now the mayor of Mississauga, introduced 2 petitions saying that queer people should not be considered protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you can make the argument, oh, she was just representing her constituents, but you do have a choice whether or not you introduce a petition or not. And if you find it morally odious, you don't have to do it. So clearly it didn't meet that bar for Charlie. But also I do understand why Mr. Angus might have felt the need to, or felt like it was acceptable to promote, even though regardless of whether he agrees with it personally, just on the basis that a lot of Canadians probably do not disagree. And I think whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, a conversation surely must be had if enough Canadians think that citizenship should be revocable, because if you and I believe it shouldn't, then if clearly this is a debate that's starting to be had whether or not we're there.
Totally. And I look, I think Charlie also probably put it forward, even if he maybe doesn't disagree with it, just because he thinks it's a spicy debate to have. And, let's put a bit of pressure on Elon Musk. But as good as it may make us feel to go after Elon in this way, I think we have to, the responsibility of public office holders is to think about all of the potential consequences of their actions. And this one just has way too many.
We don't want to go back to World War II where we're putting dual citizens, American Canadians in camps the same way that we put Japanese Canadians in America. Exactly. And that may seem absurd to some people at home. You're like, there's no way that bigotry could ever get to that way against Americans. And yet I am a person who wrote a column saying Canada should freeze and starve the Yanks. So we do. It's easier to get to that point than people admit, and you do have to guard that in yourself.
That's right. And I think if there's one thing we can take from this particular debate on this particular idea, it's that we should, as Canadians, be considering the non-tariff weapons that we have to go after Trump and Trumpism and the enablers of Trumpism in the United States. And, citizenship may not be the tool that we want to use for reasons that we just talked about, but there are other tools, right, that go right at the heart of this, including things like procurement, which in Elon's case would actually be quite relevant given the significant deployment of Starlink in Canada.
Indeed. Like, we can hit him on Starlink, we can hit him on Tesla. There are a lot of, and ultimately for a billionaire like him, his wealth is much more valuable than a single citizenship for a multinational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's interesting, like I just mentioned X, like there are Canadian companies that own part of his debt. And right now they're actually in a process. Elon is trying to go out and do another round of potential sale of debt in the company at a valuation very consistent with what he bought originally. There are Canadian banks that own some of that debt. What are we doing with that? How are we going to potentially force those banks to write down?
There has been some reporting that, is there not a certain threshold of financial losses for Twitter at which he gets margin called and the debt converts into equity?
Depending, each lender has may have a slightly different agreement with him, but yes, and that there are covenants that he has to maintain as a borrower. I mean, the thing, the dirty little secret about his debt is, I think a lot of people knew that he would be a destructive force to this asset. And that he was probably buying the asset for basically non-economic purposes, largely just to have influence and to create a political vehicle that would help him monetize other things like the 2024
And he was very
US
successful
election.
in that regard. Like, it is indisputable
100%,
that
100%.
Like, we all mocked him for wasting money, but if the goal wasn't economic, if the goal was societal influence and control,
100%.
then he won.
And some lenders would have been willing to still give him money knowing the thing would not work out, because what they're trying to actually do with their money is to develop a relationship with him, because they want access to the next deal of private equity that he's going to be involved in with SpaceX or some other platform that actually has significant economic potential. And they just want that. But to get that, they need to be in the deal room, right? And so this is, I think this is the kind of stuff that would surprise most people, but it is the part of the considerations that goes into a lot of deal flow in private equity.
Could you call that, in a way, a twisted form of government relations, giving a senior member of the United States government it's the same as when I looked at companies donating to Trump's inauguration fund, and I was kind of horrified when I found out Democrats do this too. And I'm like, what do you mean private companies are donating to throw you a parade?
Yeah, no, totally. It has significant government relations implications to it. I'm not sure that a lot of those lenders necessarily thought about that. I mean, some of them would have, because they're very significant. I mean, the Qataris, for example, have a large stake in the deal structure.
The Qataris,
but, for the Canadians,
Saudi
right?
Arabia, there was a lot of influence to be bought in that deal.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, right, is that if you're a Canadian financial institution, especially if you're a bank who's financed part of the deal, and there are a few Canadian banks that were part of the deal, they have to, as part of what they show the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada, they have to show their corporate book on a regular basis to our financial regulator, our bank regulator. And there's an assessment of risk associated with that book as to whether or not they need to make loss provisions, potentially to how they've valued what they think they're going to get back on that debt. Some lenders in the United States have gone so far as to take a 70% write down on their debt. I don't know if that's the case that's happened in Canada, but there's a very interesting capital regulation question there, and that in and of itself would have direct implications potentially to the going valuation that Musk could command on his next deal in this space.
It would have a domino effect, because obviously lenders around the world would pay attention.
Absolutely.
Well, food for thought. I think we will leave it there, folks. But Tyler, thank you so much for coming on our program. You had a lot to say, and we appreciated every bit of it.
Yeah, it was fun. And congratulations on the podcast. I'm looking forward to seeing how it goes.
Thank you so much. Tyler Meredith, everybody. And that's the end of this week's episode. Thank you to Tyler Meredith for joining the program. Thank you to all of you for listening in, and we will see you next week with more on It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau. Cheers.